other persons involved in this webinar for having given me this wonderful opportunity to meet you all again virtually. You all remember that during our last session, I spoke about the essential requirements which are to be satisfied when we plead before a court of law for a decree for specific performance based on a contract. To recapitulate what we discussed last time, I want to tell you that to begin with, I told that there has to be, first of all, a valid contract which is enforceable in law. Secondly, the plaintiff should plead and prove that he was always ready and willing to perform his part of contract. And I also told about the latest amendment made in 2018 in section 16C of the Specific Relief Act, which says that there need not be any plea, but it is enough that there is a proof that the plaintiff was always ready and willing to perform his part of contract. I also told you that readiness, willingness means not jingling the coin by keeping the same in his handbag or pocket. It is enough to prove before the court about the source of money to perform, to pay the consideration in a suit for specific performance of a contract of sale. And I also told that willingness is a different aspect which is to be gathered from the conduct of the parties. And referring to section 10 of the Act, I also pointed out that prior to 2018, the courts were given an absolute discretion to decline to grant the decree for specific performance, though the plaintiff is otherwise entitled for a decree for performance. What are the guiding principles upon which such a the court can decline to grant decree has also been dealt with very elaborately by me last time. I think that you have all understood what I said. And I also told you that the question as to whether the amendment to these two provisions in the Specific Relief Act made in 2018 is prospective or it is only retrospective is a matter to be answered by the Honorable Supreme Court. And I concluded saying that we are waiting for authoritative pronouncement on this aspect. Last time I assured you that I would come again on this platform to tell you about the other aspects such as the valid defenses available for a defendant and the rights of a bona fide purchaser, and also the defenses available for him. Today, I think that within a short time, I'll finish these aspects of the issue, and then I will throw it open for you to raise queries, if any, which I will try to answer. My dear friends, let us assume that you are appearing for the defendant in a suit for specific performance of contract. Plaintiff has avowed in his plaint that there was a contract which was entered into between the parties validly. He pleads. Then he also pleads, as required under section 16C, that he was ready, always and willing to perform his part of contract. That pleading also he has made. With this, he has filed a suit. You are asked to appear for the defendant, the owner of the property, the prospective vendor. If the vendor who has already proposed to sell the property now takes a decision not to go ahead with this contract and to complete the sale, what are the legal remedies available for him to do so? avenues open for him to do so. For that purpose, we may at the outset refer to section 9 of the Specific Relief Act. A plain reading of section 9 of the Specific Relief Act would go to clearly show that all the defenses which are available to a defendant under any law relating to contracts are available. So these two enactments, namely Indian Contract Act and the Specific Relief Act, are twin enactments governing more or less the same area in the matter of specific performance of contracts. So you cannot look at the provisions of the Specific Relief Act alone, completely ignoring the provisions of the Indian Contract Act. As I already told you, we can enforce only a valid contract as per the provisions of the Specific Relief Act. What is a valid contract has not been defined in the Specific Relief Act. This act is only in respect of enforceability or how to enforce a contract. What is a contract which is valid is to be seen only in terms of the provisions of the Indian Contract Act. Similarly, what are all the grounds which are available for a defendant in a suit are also to be again seen only in the provisions of the Contract Act. So completely keeping the Contract Act aside, you cannot defend a suit for specific performance. Indication for that is found in section 9 itself. Let me read section 9 for your benefit. I quote, except as otherwise provided herein, where any relief is claimed under this chapter in respect of a contract, the person against whom the relief is claimed may plead by way of defense any ground which is available to him under any law relating to contracts. Therefore, it gives a clear idea that a defendant in a suit against whom a suit for specific performance has been filed can plead by way of defense. What are those defenses? Those defenses which are available to him under the law of contract. So now, therefore, we have to refer to the provisions of the Contract Act. What are the defenses available? Now, if you commence from section 10 onwards of the Contract Act, you will find that there are a lot of defenses available for a defendant. Section 10 speaks of agreements which are contracts, which means which are valid and enforceable in law. It says all agreements are contracts if they are made by free consent of parties. Number one, essential requirement is free consent of parties. Second, competent to contract. Second, 3, for a lawful consideration. 4, and with a lawful object. And 5, and are not hereby expressly declared to be void. So in 3 lines in the Contract Act, what are all the defenses available for a defendant in such a suit have been in a very cogent manner and in clear terms defined. You take one after the other, there are 5 defenses available for you. Defense number 1 is that in respect of the consent, the plaintiff will plead that there was a free consent on the part of both the parties, and therefore the contract is valid and lawfully enforceable. The defense available for the defendant is no, there was no free consent. It is not for the sake of argument. Out of imagination, such a defense can be taken. If really on facts, the party is satisfied that he did not give free consent, then it will be one of the valid defenses available for him. If the defendant is able to prove during the trial that the consent obtained from him was not a free consent, then the contract is only voidable, and therefore he can avoid it, and the same cannot be enforced. So this is the first defense available. That is in respect of the consent, whether it is free consent or not a free consent. Question number 1. Now keep this in mind for a moment. We are going to say as to what are all the consents which are free and what are all the consents which are not free. We are going to deal with that. The statute has elaborately dealt with the same. You need not go and search for judgment for this. It is enough if you understand the statutory provisions in respect of the same. So to begin with, for the present, keep in your mind, there is a defense available for the defendant touching upon the consent as to whether it was free or not. This is the first defense available. Then the second defense is the competence of the party concerned. Whether the party to the contract, namely either the plaintiff or the defendant, is competent. If he is suffering from some mental illness, otherwise, if the man is of unsound mind, he is not competent to contract. Similarly, if he is a minor, that is less than 18 years of age, he is also not competent to contract. So who are all the persons who are competent to contract is also dealt with in the Act. I do not want to read those provisions which are very clearly stated. Therefore, I would say that if a person is not competent to contract, there also it will be a valid defense. Quickly for a moment, you please kindly look at section 11 of the Act. Every person is competent to contract who is of the age of majority according to the law to which he is subject, and who is of sound mind and is not disqualified from contracting by any law to which he is subject. So there are three categories of persons as defined in section 11 who are not competent to contract. Who are they? Number 1, a minor who has not completed 18 years of age. He is not competent to contract. Then second one, a person who is of not sound mind. He is also not competent to contract. And third one, who has been disqualified by any provisions of any law, like that Insolvency Act. There are so many enactments like that. If by the act of, by any statute, a person is declared as disqualified, then that person is also not competent. So these are the three persons who have been specifically mentioned in section 11 who are incompetent to enter into contract. Suppose a suit is filed against a minor or a person who is of unsound mind. He can plead that at the time of contract, I was not of sound mind, as I was suffering from mental illness, and therefore the contract cannot be enforced. So this is the second defense available for a defendant in a suit. This touches upon the competence to contract. This is second. When such a plea is taken, it is for the plaintiff to prove that the defendant was competent enough to enter into a contract, and it is for the defendant to disprove the same or to prove on his part that he was suffering from some kind of mental illness and thus he was of unsound mind as defined in section 11 of the Contract Act. This is the second defense available for a defendant. Now let us move on to the third defense. The third defense as found in section 10 is for a lawful consideration. The consideration must be lawful. If the consideration is unlawful, then also it is a defense that the contract need not be performed. For example, suppose A and B enter into a contract by which A says that if you pay me 1 lakh, I will kidnap so and so and bring to her to you. If this contract subsequently the victim is kidnapped, he has performed his contract, can you sue for the money as agreed upon under the agreement? No, it is not, because the consideration or the object is unlawful, the consideration is also unlawful. Therefore, this is the third defense available for a defendant. That is, if the consideration is unlawful. Suppose black money is agreed to be given. It is unlawful. To receive black money from a party is unlawful. So the consideration should not be unlawful. This is the third defense available in a suit. The fourth defense would be in respect to the object. What are the objects which are lawful and what are the objects which are unlawful? That is also dealt with in the Act itself. I will come to that later. I have given you one small illustration as to how an object can be held as an unlawful object. So anything forbidden by the Indian Penal Code or anything punishable under the Indian Penal Code is an unlawful object, or anything prohibited by law, by any other law, is also unlawful. The object is unlawful. So the fourth defense is unlawful object. The last one, apart from that, as indicated in section 10, the last one is those agreements which are expressly declared to be void under the provisions of the Contract Act. There are certain agreements which will not take the shape of a contract because the same has been declared as void by some of the specific provisions of this Act, which I will deal with a little later, and those contracts also cannot be enforced. So if you, as we already seen in section 9 of the Special Relief Act, all the defenses available under the Indian Contract Act are available for a defendant in the suit. What are those? Broadly speaking, there are 5 defenses available as indicated in section 10 of the Indian Contract Act. I want to recapitulate the same again. Number 1, consent, whether it is free or not. Number 2, competence, whether the person was of sound mind, whether he is a major, this is the second part, or whether he was disqualified. This is second. Third one, consideration whether lawful or unlawful. Fourth one, whether the object of the agreement is lawful or unlawful. And lastly, whether the said agreement or contract has been declared as void under any of the provisions of the Indian Contract Act. So these are the valid defenses available for a defendant. Now let us see as to who are all competent to contract. I already read to you section 11. There are 3 categories of persons who are competent. Number 1, who are of sound mind, who are not prohibited by any law, who are not minors. These are all the persons who are competent, and otherwise the other kinds of persons are not competent. The first thing, section 11 and 12, you please read the original text, then you can go in for judgments. Then I told you about the consent. What is consent? In normal courts, in legal field, we used to say that consent is ad idem. That is, the party should have understood the nature of the transaction that they are undergoing, and without any undue influence, coercion, fraud, the party should have accepted to prescribe certain terms and to perform something on the part of each. So consent is nothing but something agreed out of free will of the parties to a contract. So what is consent has not been left undefined so that we can get confused. In one line, the term free consent has been defined in section 13. Please, my dear friends, look at section 13 for a moment. It defines consent. Consent, two or more persons are said to consent when they agree upon the same thing in the same sense. The same sense only we call it as consensus ad idem. I should not think one thing about the contract and the other party should not think differently. Both should have the same idea, both should have the same understanding about the nature of the transaction, about the property, about the object, about the consideration, and all necessary things pertain to the contract. So the party should agree upon the same thing in the same sense. Suppose a particular term is incorporated in the agreement, both the parties should mean to have the same sense to that particular clause. For example, suppose I say about the property. There are two properties I have in Chennai. I want to sell a property A, whereas the dependent, the other party who comes to purchase the property, thinks that it is B property. While describing the property, we simply say the property in Chennai. So it is the sense given to the description of property, which is a part of the contract, is not the same so far as both the parties are concerned. One party has the sense that this property is the A property, whereas the other party has the sense that it is the B property in Chennai. There is no consensus. There is no same sense. Please, this expression, same sense, makes all the difference. Therefore, my dear friends, section 13 clearly says that consent means the parties should understand the terms, understand the nature, understand the object, understand the consideration, and understand all the other requisite aspects of the contract in the same sense and not in different sense. This is consent. This is consent as ad idem of both the parties. Now, when I read section 10, I said that it is free consent. It is not a mere consent. It is free consent. What is free consent? What makes an ordinary consent into a free consent is also defined in section 14 of the Act. It is not only enough that there was consent, there has to be consent which is free also. When it is free, there are 5 circumstances under which a consent can be said to be either free or not free. Number 1 is consent is said to be free when it is not caused, please underline the word not caused by coercion. Not caused by coercion. Suppose a person has been coerced to give consent, forced to give consent, then the consent is not free, and therefore it is a valid defense for the defendant to say that the consent which I gave was not free. What is coercion? In the sense that is used in section 10, that is also not left without defining. Section 15 of the Act defines as what is coercion. Let us quickly move on to section 15. Coercion is the committing or threatening to commit any act forbidden by Indian Penal Code. Suppose a person is coerced, he is threatened that he will be killed unless he comes for the agreement, or his son will be kidnapped if he does not agree for selling the property or to enter into the contract, or in due course they will set fire to his properties if you do not come forward to contract, to enter into an agreement. Then these are all offenses under the Indian Penal Code. If any threat is made to commit an offense as defined in the Indian Penal Code, any offense for that matter, it may be even 506 part 2, 302, 341, any offense. If the defendant is able to show that the other party committed any one of the offenses defined dealt with in the Indian Penal Code, and by committing such offense they forced me to sign, then the consent is not a free consent. For example, suppose a person is abducted, illegally confined, where he is forced to sign under threat. He signs the agreement. This agreement is not a valid agreement because the consent is not a valid consent. Consent was obtained by committing one or more offenses under the Indian Penal Code. What are the offenses in the illustration which I gave? Kidnapping is an abduction is an offense. Confinement is an offense. Then intimidation is the third offense. And extortion is the fourth offense. By having committed 4 offenses, the other party has forced him to give consent. This consent is not a valid consent in terms of section 14 of the Act. So this is one thing. This is after having committed an offense. It is not only after having committed an offense, even by threatening to commit an offense, if consent is obtained, in such an event also, the consent is not a free consent. For example, suppose there is a threat saying that I will kidnap your daughter, I will attack, I will set fire to your house, like that I will commit an offense in future if you do not sell this property to me, if you do not enter into an agreement for sale with me, and under that threatened action to commit a crime, if consent has been obtained, that consent is not a free consent. This squarely falls under the definition of coercion. Apart from that, there are second category, or the unlawful detaining. Unlawful detaining of not only the person, any relative, any property, or anything else. Unlawfully detaining. Suppose the university certificates are retained by someone unlawfully, and by detaining the same, he says that if you want your certificates back, you agree to sell the property and sign the document. In order to get back his testimonial, he signs. This consent has been obtained by detaining the personal properties of the individual. In such an event also, the consent is not a free consent. This is yet another valid defense available for the parties. Then, threatening to detain any property. So he can keep or he can threaten to keep any property to the prejudice of any person, whatever, with the intention of causing any person to enter into an agreement. This is again somebody said that volume is not all right, Mr. Dhansekhar. Now is it okay?
It's all right.
Okay. Therefore, this is coercion. In many of the suits, we have seen that a consent is not a free consent and it was obtained by coercion. This much of pleading is not sufficient at all, my dear friends. When we plead in the written statement that the consent is not a free consent on account of coercion, you have to elaborately state in the written statement as to what was the nature of the coercion, whether it was to commit any offense, or by committing any offense, or by detaining any property already, or with a threat to detain any property. When did it happen? Where did it happen? In whose presence it happened? All these details ought to be covered in the written statement. It is not enough, my dear friends, simply to say in the written statement that the contract cannot be enforced because the consent was obtained by coercion. You have to say in the written statement as what was the nature of the coercion as defined in section 15 of the Act. This is very, very essential. Please kindly note this. Now, there is an explanation appended to that provision. We say it is immaterial whether the Indian Penal Code or is not in force in the place where the coercion is employed. We are not concerned. People in Jammu and Kashmir previously were concerned about it. We are not concerned about it. So this is section 15. So we have seen what is consent. We have seen what is free consent. And we have also seen as to what is coercion. Then the next thing which makes a consent as valid consent is which is not caused by undue influence. Please kindly see clause 2 of section 14, undue influence. If a consent has been obtained not by coercion but by unduly influencing the person concerned, in such an event also, it is a valid defense for the defendant to say that the contract cannot be enforced. What is undue influence is immediately defined in section 16 of the Contract Act. You may kindly see the original text of section 16, which gives a clear idea or understanding about undue influence. A contract is said to be induced by undue influence where the relations subsisting between the parties are such that one of the parties is in a position to dominate the will of the other and uses that position to obtain an unfair advantage over the other. So undue influence does not mean making a false representation to make the other person to believe. That is fraud. Here there are two persons. One person is in a dominant position over the other. They are not equal. So suppose one is a master and the other is a servant. The master is always in a dominant position over the other. master and servant relationship. The servant cannot be in the dominant position over the master. But the contrary, the reverse is the correct position. So when a master who is in a dominant position over a servant uses that position and obtain an unfair advantage over him, then the consent is not free consent. It has been obtained under undue influence. Therefore, friends, in order to invoke the defense of undue influence, the foremost requirement is that you have to define the relationship between the parties in the written statement. If it is so available for you, father and son, father-in-law and son-in-law, brother and sister. So in those cases, you can say that one was in a dominant position over the other. It is a question of fact. So you have to define the relationship between the parties to say that one was in a dominant position over the other. And secondly, you should also and prove that because of that dominant position, he used that position. And because of that, I gave consent. This consent is not a valid consent. Please understand, brothers. The plaintiff may try to say that either there was no such a dominant position, assuming that there was such a dominant position, he did not use that position. He may prove by facts, by letting in evidence to say that I did not use my position to influence him. I gave him free time. I allowed him to think it over. I made him to understand. Then he gave consent. For that, he can prove by means of positive evidence that it was a free consent. Therefore, if you want to succeed in your defense, that the consent was obtained by undue influence, you want to prove two things positively. Number one is to plead that the plaintiff was in a dominant position, and later during the trial you have to prove that. Secondly, not stopping with that, you have also to plead and prove that using that position, he wanted me to sign, to enter into agreement, to give consent. So the second aspect is also to be proved. If only these two things are proved, pleaded and proved, you can succeed on the defense of undue influence. Please kindly also look into subsection 3 of subsection 2. In particular and without prejudice to the generality of foregoing principle. The principle is dominance, using the dominance. That is a general principle. Without prejudice to the generality of that principle, something or more specifically stated in subsection 2 to explain as to what is undue influence. What are those circumstances? A person is deemed to be in position to dominate the will of the other. Here, please kindly see, there is a deemed clause. There is a fiction by this deeming clause. It shall be deemed to be in a position, he shall be deemed to be in a position to dominate the will of the another when there is a presumption because of this deeming clause. When, number one, where he holds a real or apparent authority over the other, or where he stands in a fiduciary relation to the other. In such an event, it shall be deemed there is a presumption. The contrary is to be proved by the plaintiff. Now, second one, where he makes a contract with a person whose mental capacity is temporarily or permanently affected by reason of age, illness, or mental or bodily distress. Suppose a person is in the hospital undergoing treatment in a very serious condition. He is not able to think. He is not able to freely think. But you go there, using your relationship, get him to give consent. Then such an event, it shall be deemed that the influence was used. You see two things here. As I told you when I dealt with subsection 1, one is dominance, second one is using the dominance. This subsection 2 deals with the second part. That is, if you are able to plead and prove dominance, then it will be deemed that he used the dominance to get the consent in these two circumstances. One, where he holds a real or apparent authority over the other, and where he stands in a fiduciary relationship. That is, first part is satisfied. The second B deals with the second part. So this also you please understand, the original text itself gives a clear understanding. Now subsection 3, where a person who is in a position to dominate the will of another enters into a contract with him and the transaction appears on the face of it, or the evidence adduced to be unconscionable, the burden of proving that such contract was not induced by undue influence shall lie upon the person in a position to dominate the will of the other. This subsection 3 deals with burden of proof. See, section 14, while defining free consent, has got 4 things: coercion, undue influence, fraud, misrepresentation, and mistake. So far as this undue influence alone is concerned, as provided in subsection 3, absence of undue influence is to be proved by the plaintiff. Suppose the defendant is able to show that the plaintiff was in a dominant position, and he also pleads that using that the signature was, the consent was obtained, then the burden to prove the absence of undue influence is upon the plaintiff. This is the reverse burden. Whereas in respect of all the other aspects like coercion, etc., the burden is upon the defendant to prove. So the only exception is in respect of this undue influence as dealt with in subsection 3. The absence of undue influence is to be proved by the defendant, by the plaintiff. Please kindly note this also. Now, the next one, as dealt with in section 14, is fraud. In common parlance, the term fraud may be understood by giving an expansive meaning. But the term fraud carries its own well-defined meaning within the 4 corners of section 17 as defined therein. What are they? In many of the plaints in the written statements, I have seen that simply saying that by playing fraud upon me, my consent was obtained. This is not enough. What was the nature of the fraud? When it was played? How it was played? In whose presence it was played? How you were influenced by that fraud? How you were carried away by that fraud? These are all the matters which are to be pleaded in the written statement. I will read section 17 for our benefit. Fraud means and includes any of the following acts: committed by a party to a contract or with his connivance or by his agent with the intent to deceive another party. So the essential ingredient is deception, thereto of his agent or to induce him to enter into the contract. So what are the necessary ingredients of fraud? Number one, there are 5 acts mentioned in this provision. They have been enumerated. Fraud means and includes any of the following, that is any of the following 5. Acts committed by the party to a contract or with the connivance or by his agent with intent to deceive the another. What are those 5 acts which constitute fraud? Number one, the suggestion as a fact of that which is not true by one who does not believe it to be true. I know that the statement which I make does not contain the truth, but knowing fully well that the statement which I make does not convey the truth, I tell the same to the other party with the intention to deceive him, with a view to persuade him by means of deception. I make a false statement. It is very simple. In very simple terms, I make a false declaration. I make a false statement to the other man. The purpose of making that is to persuade him, to deceive him, to agree for the contract, to give consent. So when I, knowing fully well, if I make a false statement with the intention of deceiving the other man, and if that other party or other man getting persuaded or getting deceived by such false statement gives consent, that consent is also not a free. This is the first one, first act which makes the consent, which makes the consent obtained by fraud. First act of fraud is making a false statement, making a false assurance, making an untrue statement. This is the first act of fraud. Please, I want to repeat, my friends, it is not only enough that he made such false statement. 2 more things are also required for you to plead. That is, you should say that he knew very well that what he was saying was a false statement. Third one is, you should also say that he made such a false statement knowingly, only with a view to deceive the defendant. These are all the essential requirements in the written statement. It is not enough to generally say that he made a false statement. You should satisfy the requirements of section 17 by incorporating all these necessary averments in the written statement. Then go to the next act of fraud. The active concealment of a fact by one having knowledge or belief of the fact. So concealing any fact. Let us say that already there is an agreement for sale entered into with a third party, or he has already sold a part of the property. Again he wants to sell the same without disclosing the same. Then his statement amounts to concealment of a fact. This act may be brought both under limb 1 or limb 2. Then third act of fraud would be a promise made without any intention of performing it. He knows that it will not be possible for him to perform. He knows that he is not going to perform. And with that intention, with that bad intention of not performing it, if he makes the promise That also amounts to fraud. Then fourth act of fraud would be any other act fitted to deceive. Anything done, any statement or any act done with a view to deceive the other man. That is the fourth kind of the fraud that can be committed. Fifth one is any such act or omission of law specifically declared to be fraudulent. So these are the defenses available for the defendant when he pleads fraud. My friend, why I am stressing more here is that it is not enough for the defendant to simply say that by playing fraud upon me, he has obtained my consent. What I would tell you, convey to you is that when you draft a written statement, you should say out of these 5 acts which are enumerated in section 7, your case falls under what act is to be specifically stated. The act of the plaintiff may fall either one or more of these acts, but you have to specifically state this man did this on facts. This falls under the category of fraud defined in this provision. That is how you have to make the pleading. You know very well that in general, we have accepted the principle that any amount of evidence without there being a pleading is of no use. You know very well. Therefore, to avoid such a plea being taken against you as a defendant, please ensure that the written statement specifically averts all these facts, details are defined in section 17 of the Act. So generally don't draft any written statement. Give specific instances satisfying the specific averments, specific ingredients of these provisions, namely section 13 to 17. Now, the last one as found, last but one, that is fourth one is misrepresentation as defined in section 18. Misrepresentation. What is misrepresentation? It means and includes the positive assertion in a manner not warranted. This is very simple. Misrepresentation means twisting the facts, giving a different picture of the same. That is misrepresentation. This is also a defense available for the defendant. Twisting the facts, if he gives a different picture with a view to make the other man to believe the same and to act upon, then the plaintiff is guilty of misrepresentation. Here, misrepresentation is different from fraud. Misrepresentation is different from undue influence. All these 4 deal with different aspects of transactions which make the consent as not a free consent. So don't confuse between one and the other. They deal with the different aspects. That is why very elaborately all these things have been held in these provisions by making a very good definition of each term used. Now, section 19 says as to what is the legal effect of a consent obtained without free consent. Suppose there is a fraud played, suppose there is undue influence, suppose there was coercion, suppose there was misrepresentation. Yes, you are able to prove. Now, what is the legal effect of such proof? The legal effect is that the contract which was obtained by which suffers from any one of these vices, making the consent not a free consent, makes the contract a voidable contract. It does not make the contract, even if it is the consent has been obtained by fraud, the contract is not void, it is only voidable. At the option of whom? The victim of these acts, who has given the consent because of these acts of the plaintiff. The option is with him. He may avoid the contract, or he may, despite all these vices, he may say that I am prepared to go by the contract. I am prepared to perform my part. Please you perform the other part. He can force the other party. He can compel the other party to enforce his part of the contract. The option is only with the victim, not with the other. The contract does not become void. Please, my dear friends, very often we confuse between voidable and void. Voidable contract, you know very well, is the one with the need to be avoided. Until it is specifically avoided, the contract is valid. By some act, the defendant has to avoid the contract. In the written, it is in my perception, the contract can be avoided by sending a notice to him immediately. Suppose today contract is obtained by threat or promise. Tomorrow, the defendant may issue a notice to him informing that the contract is voidable because his consent was not free consent and therefore he has avoided. He can simply say that the contract is avoided and therefore it cannot be enforced. This can be done by sending a notice to the other party. Now again, it is a question of fact. Whether the consent was obtained by fraud, coercion, etc., or matters to be proved by means of letting or adducing sufficient evidence. This is a matter to be gathered by means of various circumstances. One of the circumstances would be the quick reaction on the part of the victim. If suppose he says that on January 1st he was abducted, he was detained, and his consent was obtained and his signature was obtained in the document, and thus the consent is not a free consent, what would have been his natural human conduct as dealt with in section 114 of the Indian Evidence Act? Any man of ordinary prudence would have immediately resisted. The next day, as soon as he was freed, what would have been his natural conduct? He would have gone to the police, he would have gone to the panchayatans, he would have sent notice, he would have taken some people to him, to the other man, not to enforce it, like that. So these are all the natural human conduct of any man of ordinary prudence. If he has not done any of these, and after the suit is filed, if he takes this plea that my consent was not free, I was abducted, I was detained, and therefore it is not a valid contract, the contract cannot be enforced, it is a voidable contract, would the court accept this? It will be, in my view, very difficult for the court to accept this plea. The reason is the conduct. The conduct of this person is quite unnatural. By exhibiting natural conduct of an ordinary prudent man, he was expected to react immediately by going to the police, by going to the panchayatar, like that. If he has not done that, it can be presumed, it may be presumed under section 114 that his plea that consent was not free and therefore the contract is voidable is not true and the same may be rejected. Suppose a party comes to you, you will quite naturally ask him, any lawyer will ask him, why you did not go to the police? Why you did not raise objection? Why you did not send notice immediately to the other party? He may give explanation. He may say that he is a powerful man. Out of fear for life, I did not go to the police. He may say, I went to the Panchayatats. The Panchayatats wanted me to wait for some time. Every day I was going to the Panchayatats. The Panchayatats were in touch with him and they wanted me to wait. Believing that they would resolve, I did not issue notice. Believing that they would resolve, I did not go to the police. So this kind of explanation, if it is true, may be offered. It is one thing that the explanation may be accepted by the court. The other thing is the court may not accept or act upon the explanation. If the court accepts this explanation, then there is nothing unnatural in his conduct, in not reacting immediately. And in such an event, the court may accept, I can say, will accept the plea of the defendant that the consent was not a free consent and therefore the contract is a voidable contract. So friends, it is for us to make proper averments in the written statement. The party who comes to you may not know about these legal niceties. That is, therefore, it is all the more necessary for you to have complete interaction with the party and to know the facts and to incorporate all those things by way of averments in the written statement. Here at this stage, I want to again repeat two important facts. Number one, requirement. Number one, you have to plead that the consent was not free. Is it enough? No. How the consent was not free, you have to plead. If you say yes, it was obtained by fraud, then you have to further say as to what was the kind of fraud that was played out of the 5 acts which have been enumerated in the act. What was the nature of the fraud which was played upon him? Then, not stopping with that, you should also plead that but for the fraud played, but for the coercion, but for the undue influence, you would not have given consent. That also you have to plead. And after that, you have to explain your conduct after the consent was given. If you do not explain your conduct immediately after the consent or the fraud comes to light, coercion comes to light, or you are freed from all these vices, what was your conduct? This part of the pleading in the written statement, my friends, is absolutely essential for you to make. So if you make specific plea on these aspects, then only you will be permitted by the court to lead evidence. Then only the plea will be considered. Friends, I know that I am guilty of repeating, but still I want to repeat because out of experience I have seen that pleadings are in many occasions found to be wanting. The most important thing is the conduct of the defendant after the consent was given. What was his reaction? Please kindly keep these words in your mind. Reaction. How did he react immediately thereafter? This conduct makes all the difference. This conduct is after all the personal conduct of the man which needs to be explained. The test for the court is the ordinary conduct of an ordinary prudent man in a given situation. That is the standard which will apply to see whether your conduct is natural or unnatural. It may appear that you are acting, not reacting immediately, may give rise to a presumption that your conduct is unnatural and therefore your plea is false. In order to avoid that, in order to meet that kind of situation, friends, I want to impress upon you that you have to make necessary pleading in the statement, explaining your conduct after the consent was given. This is the most important thing. My dear friends, keep this in your mind. Now, hitherto we have seen contracts which are voidable. As dealt with in section 10 of the Act, the last part is, if the contract is expressly declared to be void, then that contract cannot be enforced. That is done in section 20 of the Contract Act, which states where agreement void, where both the parties are under mistake as to a matter of fact essential to the agreement is void. So understanding about the fact, the illustration is will give a clear idea as to what it says. So in respect of a particular fact which is essential to the agreement, there has to be consensus ad idem. There should not be any mistake on the part of the parties. Here, it is not the mistake on the part of one party. Please understand this. It is not enough to say that I had mistaken this fact like this. Both parties, where both the parties to an agreement are under mistake, it is not enough to say that one party is under a mistaken impression and therefore he is and therefore the agreement is void. That kind of plea is not available. Then another important provision which I would like to refer to is section 29. There are so many other provisions. Section 30 also speaks of void agreement, etc. Very often, what are the matters which come up before the court? I want to touch upon that. You come to section 29, which says agreements, the meaning of which is not certain, are capable of being made certain or void. See, if the terms of the contract are not certain, or if it conveys no definite meaning, then the contract is void. You please see the illustration. A agrees to sell B 100 tons of oil. There is nothing whatsoever to show what kind of oil was intended. The agreement is void for uncertainty. Suppose I own 5 cars. I enter into an agreement to sell 1 car. The description says that I will sell 1 car. Which car? One car may be of value 2 lakhs, the other one may be of 10 lakhs, the other one may be of 20 lakhs. Which car? There is uncertainty. This illustration would give you a clear idea as to what is uncertainty. Uncertainty means that in respect of description of property, suppose the agreement says the property in Tirunelveli is agreed to be sold. The person may have 4 or 5 properties in Tirunelveli. Which property is to be sold? So the description of property should be certain. The description of property should be certain and it should not be uncertain. Please understand this. Okay. Suppose there is a mistake. There is only a mistake in the description of property. Whether it can be rectified by the parties. If you look at section 26 of the Specific Relief Act, I will read the provision. Please kindly see. This also comes up very often before courts because many a times the agreements are drafted by people who are not well conversant with the legal provisions, and therefore there are a lot of loopholes in those things. Suppose some description is wrong in respect of foreboundary, or in respect of survey number, or in respect of extent. If there is some mistake, whether it can be corrected. Please kindly see section 26 of the Specific Relief Act. When through fraud or mutual mistake of the parties, please understand this. That is why I read to you about section 20 of the Contract Act. When I refer to section 20 of the Contract Act, I said, as found in the clear text of the provision, the contract is void if both the parties to an agreement are under a mistake as to the matter of fact. Mistake. Here, a plea may be taken that the contract is void and therefore it is not enforceable. But for the plaintiff, there is an avenue open for him to rectify the mistake. You please kindly section 26 of the Specific Relief Act. So section 20 of the Contract Act and section 26 of the Specific Relief Act are to be read conjointly. Section 26 says, when through fraud or mutual mistake of the parties, a contract or other instrument in writing, contract or other instrument does not express the real intention, then either party or his representative interest may institute a suit to have the instrument rectified. The plaintiff may, in any suit in which any right arising under the instrument is in issue, claim in his pleading that the instrument be rectified. I am now concerned with subsection 1B of section 26. Subsection 1A deals with an instrument. Suppose there is a sale deed in which there is a small mistake, like one side of the 4 boundaries has been wrongly mentioned, or survey number instead of 17-1A, it is mentioned as 17-1B, like that small mistake. Otherwise 4 boundaries are correct, everything is correct. The document needs to be rectified. The purchaser goes to the vendor and wants him to rectify, to execute a deed of rectification so as to rectify the defect. If the vendor refuses to execute a deed of rectification, the remedy for the purchaser is to file a separate suit as mentioned in section 26(1)(a), seeking a direction to the other party to rectify the said mistake. This is an independent suit to be filed in respect of an instrument. Now we are not in respect of an instrument like sale deed, mortgage deed, etc. We are dealing with a case of contract. That is also dealt with in subsection 1. How to rectify a mistake in the sale agreement. Suppose there is a mistake. How to rectify the same? There is an enabling provision by way of subsection 1B, which states the plaintiff may in any suit in which any right arising under the instrument is in issue, claim in his pleading that the instrument be rectified. Therefore, it is open for the plaintiff to ask for one more plea. Other than the plea for a decree for specific performance, he may also ask for rectification of the agreement itself. Please kindly see how it is fantastically the provision has been made. Now, at times we are confused when a document, when an agreement is produced and it contains some mistakes. If we do not know about this provision, then we will be tempted to say that either the agreement is void in terms of section 20, or we may say, we may go by the same mistake in our plaint also. In order to meet such a kind of situation, this provision has been made, which says that it is open for the plaintiff to ask for rectification of the agreement. I am not asking about the amendment of the plaint. I am saying about the amendment of the agreement itself. A question may be asked. The agreement is bilateral between two parties without the consent of the other. How can this be rectified? Yes, it is possible by way of judicial intervention under subsection 1B. Please, my dear friends, make note of this provision 1B, where the plaintiff is entitled to ask for rectification of the mistake in the very agreement itself. So this is a very peculiar provision. If you want to, as a counsel appearing for a plaintiff, if you want to avoid any defense being taken under the garb of section 20 of the Contract Act to say that it is void, you can say, yes, it is a mistake. Yes, it is a mutual mistake, but it is to be rectified. We intended to do this, but by mistake, by typographical error, this has happened. Therefore, it needs to be rectified. For this, there are a number of judgments, and one judgment was brought to my notice by Mr. N. Manoharan, the learned senior advocate, when I was talking to him. That judgment is, and at this stage I have to thank Mr. Manoharan also, because he helped me a lot in so many matters. So I want to show one judgment for this purpose, that is AIR 2008 Supreme Court, AIR 2008 Supreme Court, page 1960. Puran Ram versus Baguram. 2008 judgment. As a matter of fact, these two provisions were comparatively dealt with several decades before by the Madras High Court in AIR 1921 Madras, page 664. A division bench judgment, a classic judgment which you need to read to understand this provision. In that case, before the Madras High Court division bench, at the time when the suit was filed, the plaint was drafted in terms of or in concurrence with the facts averred in the agreement. As a result, the mistakes which were found in the agreement were simply carried in the plaint also. After noticing this mistake, a petition was filed before the High Court, before the trial court, seeking an amendment of not only the plaint but also the agreement. A plea was taken that in order to rectify the mistake in the agreement, you want to file only an independent suit and not in the same suit that you can ask for the relief. This was the plea taken. But interpreting this subsection 1B of section 120 of section 26, which is says the plaintiff may in any suit in which the right arising under the instrument is in issue, claim in his pleading that the instrument be rectified. C. A defendant in any such suit as referred to in clause B may, in addition to any other defense open to him, ask for rectification of the instrument. So this is available not only for the plaintiff and also for the defendant. They are equally positioned. Considering all these things, the Madras High Court in 1921 judgment said that at any stage, even at the appellate stage, a petition can be filed to amend not only the plaint, but to rectify the mistake in the instrument itself, in the contract, in the agreement itself. AR 1921 Madras, page 664, Raipur Manufacturing, Julhandi, Raipur Manufacturing Limited versus J. Venkata Subbarao. This judgment was approved later by the Honorable Supreme Court in AR 2008 Supreme Court, page 1960, Puran Ram, which I just now referred to. See, if you look at paragraph 11, it has been very clearly and in a very lucid manner, it has been held by the Honorable Supreme Court in the following words, I quote, if through fraud or mutual mistake, so the error in the document may be on account of mutual mistake or by fraud played by one person. The agreement in writing does not express the real intention. It is open to the parties to apply for amendment of the instrument. Section 26 clearly permits the court to allow the party at any stage to amend the plaint as well as the agreement itself. Please kindly note this judgment, which will be very, very useful for you, because in many cases we see that there are mistakes in the instrument itself. So this can be corrected. Friends, I have hitherto told you as to what are all the defenses which are available as dealt with in section 9 of the Specific Relief Act. The defenses available under the Indian Contract Act, which I have already told you, are all very much available, apart from the defenses available in the Specific Relief Act itself. What are the defenses available in the Specific Relief Act? I have already dealt with the same in my earlier lecture, where I said that about 16C, section 10, and personal relief. So many things I already dealt with. So therefore, I do not want to repeat those things as to what are all the defenses available validly under the Specific Relief Act out of paucity of time. Now, whether time is essence of contract. Indian Contract Act says that time is essence of whether time is essence of contract or it should be performed within the time, etc. Now, for that, you may also kindly look into chapter 6 of the Contract Act, which speaks on the performance of contracts. So there are so many defenses available which are dealt with in this chapter. I don't think that I will have time to take you through all these provisions. Important provisions in this chapter are, which are often used by us in courts, are section 37, which speaks of obligation of parties to contract. 38, effect of refusal to accept the offer of performance. Suppose one person refuses to accept the performance, what is the legal effect? Then we will go to section 43, any one of the joint promisors may be compelled to perform. It is not necessary that everyone should be compelled. Any one person may be compelled to perform the contract, that is the joint promisors and joint promises. And section 44 speaks of relieving one of the joint promisors or promises by the other party. What is the legal effect? Whether the other party will stand discharged? No, he will still be obliged to perform the contract. Then section 46 speaks of the time for performance of contract. It is only under this provision we say whether the time is the essence of contract or not. All these things we look at these provisions. It says the parties may agree to perform the contract within a particular time. If it is not done, what is the remedy? What is the defense available? I have already dealt with the same. What is the whether time is essence of contract? What are the cases in which it shall be presumed that time is essence of contract, and what are the cases in which we hold that time is not essence of contract? All these things we have already dealt with. I do not want to repeat the same. Now, lastly, before closing my lecture, I want to refer to yet another important provision of the Contract Act, which speaks of novation, rescission, and alteration of contract. It is again in 2 lines, but this provision also plays a vital role in the suit for specific performance. See, it reads like this. If the parties to a contract agree to substitute a new contract for it, or to rescind, or to alter it, the original contract need not be performed. This is yet another valid defense available for the parties. Friends, here again, as a defendant, if you want to take the plea that the earlier contract upon which the suit has been filed for specific performance suffers from novation, rescission, or alteration, you have to make a specific plea. AIR 1997 Supreme Court, page 2517, is a classic judgment on that, where the Honorable Supreme Court has said that in order to bring your case under any one of the aspects contained in section 62 of the Contract Act, there has to be a specific plea. There has to be a specific plea, there has to be a specific issue, and there has to be evidence relating to prove that there was a subsequent agreement entered into between the parties, which with a view to rescind, alter, or to substitute the earlier contract. This is very, very simple. Suppose there is an agreement for sale for rupees 10 lakhs. Subsequently, the parties enter into another agreement in which it is stated that is the sale consideration shall be rupees 20 lakhs. Can the first contract be enforced wherein the parties agree to sell the property only for 10 lakhs? Whether the period of limitation will be counted on the basis of the first agreement? These are all some of the interesting questions while referring to section 62. The answer would be an emphatic no, because by executing or entering into a subsequent contract, though there is no specific recital in the subsequent contract about the first contract, the first contract stands cancelled. It has been cancelled. Therefore, no suit can be filed based on the first contract. But at the same time, if there is only an alteration of some of the terms of the contract, whether such contract, namely the original contract, has been enforced, because section 62 speaks of alteration of the original contract. If there is alteration of the original contract, the first contract, the original contract, need not be performed. So mere alteration. Can we say that any kind of alteration would entitle the other party not to perform the contract? No, it is not so. This provision has also come up before the Honorable Supreme Court on several occasions. There are several judgments on this. I think that it will be suffice for me to cite only one judgment, which is of very recent origin. Chrysomar, CHRISOMAR, Chrysomar Corporation Limited versus MJR Steels. MJR Steels. 2017, SEC Online, Supreme Court, page 1104. Recent judgment by Honorable Justice Merriman. He says, while interpreting section 62, falling in line with various previous judgments of the Honorable Supreme Court in the following words. The term alter in section 62 means it must be clear. It must be clear that the alteration must go to the root and change the essential character of the contract. If modified contract has no independent legs to stand, there is no new contract which has come into being. This, in our understanding, we call it a supplementary agreement. Suppose adding or altering some of the clauses in the first agreement, a second agreement is entered into. The second agreement will not have a stand to stand on its own legs. It will not have legs to stand on its own. This will stand on the legs of the first agreement. So in such an event, this being only a subsequent supplemental agreement, that will not make the first agreement non-performable. The law is so clear on this alteration. Very often, friends, very often this issue comes up before the court. Alteration by means of subsequent agreement. Alteration is permissible, but if the alteration goes to the very root of the agreement and changes its very character, in such an event alone, the first contract, the original contract, need not be performed. In other words, if the subsequent contract is only in the nature of supplementing certain clauses, imposing certain more conditions, creating some more terms, giving some more rights, without altering the character of the original contract, then the original contract is still liable to be performed by both the parties. This is a very, very important provision, because in many cases, this kind of defense is taken that the first transaction has been substituted by another contract. Therefore, that cannot be enforced. The first contract has been altered by subsequent contract. Therefore, it cannot be enforced. These defenses are taken. Therefore, my friends, the three kinds of contracts which need not be performed are: number one, when there is a fresh agreement or a new contract substituting the earlier. Suppose it is said that the earlier one is cancelled and this is created, or in the place of original, this is substituted, then the original contract need not be performed. Number one. Number 2, rescission of contract for some legal grounds. One of the parties has rescinded the contract, or both the parties have given up the contract, the original contract, which amounts to rescission. In such an event also, the contract need not be performed. The third category is alteration. A contract, original contract, if stands altered by a subsequent contract, very often there arises confusion whether the subsequent contract will make the first contract or render the first contract non-performable is a question. This has been very clearly answered in the judgment, wherein the Honorable Supreme Court has said that the test is whether the very nature of the essential character of the first contract has been altered. That is the test. If the answer to that question is in the affirmative, then the first contract need not be performed. It does not make the contract void. Section only mandates that it need not be performed. At the same time, if the answer to that question is in the negative, that is, if it is found that by alteration, the essential character of the first contract has not been altered, then the second contract will not alter the first contract, that is original contract, as non-performable. So this is section 62 of the Contract Act. I think that I have touched upon the very important provisions of the Contract Act. Now, in respect of section 20 of the Specie Relief Act, whether the escalation of price can be a ground taken by the defendant to say that the contract cannot be performed. The Honorable Supreme Court, this is one of the circumstances, but this is not the only circumstance, is the answer given by the Supreme Court. If you want to look for any judgment, please lay your hands on this judgment. That is AIR 2012, Supreme Court, page 2035. That is Narinderjit Singh versus Northeastern Company Limited. Please kindly read the judgment. We say that mere escalation of price, the agreement was entered into 1990. Now we are in 2020. How many years have gone? Price has gone up, etc., etc. This cannot be the only ground to refuse to grant the decree for specific performance as per section 20 of the Specie Relief Act. I think that during my last session I have dealt with section 20, therefore I do not want to repeat. And in respect of the time of, whether the time is the essence of contract, last time I dealt with the same. Just today, I want to bring to your notice only two judgments of the Honorable Supreme Court on this aspect. One is by a constitutional bench of the Supreme Court in Chandrani versus Kamal Rani, 1993, 1 SEC, page 519. Followed by Saradamani Kandappan versus, that's a very subsequent judgment. Saradamani is a popular judgment. So in these cases, the Honorable Supreme Court has held that in respect of immovable properties, the presumption shall be that the time is not essence of contract. That is a presumption. But at the same time, whether the time was meant to be essence of contract or not is a matter to be gathered from various circumstances. There are three such circumstances enumerated or pointed out by the Honorable Supreme Court, which are: number one, from the express terms of the contract; two, from the nature of the property; and three, from the surrounding circumstances. Please kindly read, keep in mind these three judgments for that purpose. Now, one more thing I want to tell you about: the defendant who has purchased the property pendent liti. The person who sold the property may not be interested in contesting the suit. He may leave the purchaser in lurch. So there is, see, let us say that there is an agreement for sale which is unregistered. Suppressing the same, the owner of the property sells the property to some X. The now suit has been filed against the vendor as well as the X. The vendor, having pocketed the money, may not be interested in contesting the suit. He may remain ex parte. Then what will happen to the bona fide purchaser? Law says that the defenses available to his vendor are all available for him also. That is, all the defenses available for the other man as per the Contract Act and as per the Specific Relief Act are all available for the pendent liti purchaser for value without notice. These two conditions are essential. He should purchase the property for value and without having notice of the earlier agreement. These are the two essential qualifications that he should have. If he is able to prove that he is a bona fide purchaser for value, then he can also, apart from that, that is a valid defense. Apart from that defense, he can also invoke all the defenses which are available for the purchase, for the vendor. There are three judgments I want to bring to your notice. AIR 2009 Supreme Court 2157, AIR 2009 Supreme Court 2157, AIR 1954 Supreme Court, the earliest judgment that is being followed till today. AIR 1954 Supreme Court page 75, and 2005 8 SEC page 695. So 2005, this is the latest judgment. In all these cases, the court has taken a consistent view that the defenses available, right, readiness and willingness, whether plaintiff was ready and willing to perform his part of contract, that defense is also available for a pendent liti purchaser. So in other words, the defenses which are available for the vendor are available for the purchaser, simply because the vendor, having pocketed the money, has chosen to remain ex parte by playing fraud upon this man, by suppressing the existence of the contract. Need not worry the purchaser, because the purchaser has got all the remedies available under the Act itself. Then lastly, only one thing I want to say. In a suit for specific performance, normally we say that please grant a decree for specific performance. This is what we say. So suppose the possession is with the vendor, no relief is sought for delivery of possession. What is the legal position regarding that? Now, there were conflicting views taken by various courts. One view taking that you want to file a separate suit for recovery of possession, and you cannot file a simple execution petition for recovery. So the court which passes the decree for specific performance has to confine its decree only for execution of the sale deed. Beyond that, the court cannot do anything, was one view. The other view was, no, he can, though the decree is silent about the possession, the executing court can deliver the property from the vendor by judicial process. The absence of such a direction in the decree is not a matter at all, was the second view. Third view was, no, in a suit itself, apart from asking for the decree for specific performance, you should also ask for the relief of recovery of delivery of possession. Now, friends, look at the judgment of the Honorable Supreme Court in AIR 1982 Supreme Court, page 818. This is a very interesting judgment where the Supreme Court, after having elaborately analyzing all the early judgment, has held that it is available for the plaintiff to ask for the relief of delivery of possession after the sale deed is executed. This is available for him. One relief which is definitely available for him. The second relief is, though he has not asked for such a relief, it is well within the powers of the court to pass such a direction, making a part of the decree to deliver possession. This is also available for the court. Suppose the court has failed or has not done, I don't call it as failure, the court has confined only to the decree for specific performance and has not said anything about the delivery of possession. Even then, the party need not file a separate suit for recovery of possession. He can very well file one execution petition and take delivery of possession, because the decree for specific performance includes every other incidental relief connected to this specific performance. This was the view taken by the Honorable Supreme Court in this judgment in AIR 1982 Supreme Court. So I think that I have covered some of the important provisions. I have also brought to your notice some of the important judgments of the Honorable Supreme Court. I have not covered one most important area. I don't think that there is time, but quickly in 1 minute I will say about that. About the refund of the advance money or the earnest money. Whether there has to be a plea made as required in the specific relief act, or even in the absence of such a plea, in order to avoid multiple litigations. The court can issue such a direction for the refund of earnest money or the advance money. Friends, there is a vast difference between earnest money and advance money. I am only citing two judgments. Please kindly go through the judgment. I don't find time today to take you through the judgment. Number one is AIR 1926, Privy Council, page 1, 1926. Siramjit Singh versus Harswarup. That was followed in AIR, that was approved by the Supreme Court. In AIR 1970 Supreme Court, page 1955. Where the distinction between earnest money and advance money is dealt with. Earnest money is part of the purchase money in certain circumstances. Earnest money does not form part of the purchase money in certain circumstances. That has been very elaborately dealt with. Quickly, I will say that in a suit for sale agreement, based on sale agreement, if the agreement states that such amount has been paid, it is construed always as a part of sale consideration. Therefore, you may call it either as advance, you may call it either as The other one, earnest money, you may give any name, but from the recitals by a comprehensive reading of the document, it can be held that this money is nothing but part of the sale consideration. Therefore, it is only an advance money. The last judgment on this aspect is 2004, 3 SEC page 711 by Honorable Justice D. Raju. He says, it is not the description by words used in the agreement that is determinative, but the real intention that matters. What may be worded as an advance may be really earnest money. What may be worded as earnest money may be advance money. So the wordings of the document is immaterial. The intention of the parties is to be gathered by a comprehensive reading of the entire document, by comprehending the terms of the agreement. You may say that the money is earnest money, or the money is not earnest money, but it is only an advance money. For all these, why this is also relevant when there is a plea for refund of the money with interest or not, whether charge is to be created over the property or not. These are the other aspects. I think that my time is over. I cannot detain you anymore. I am very grateful to Mr. Dhanasekaran for having given me this wonderful platform to interact with, to give me a lecture on this important subject. I believe, and I am also hopeful that I have touched upon some of the important fundamental aspects of the subject which I could dealt with today. More details, more niceties, or more nuances are to be learnt only by reading number of judgments, by making researches. There are hundreds and hundreds of judgments. In such a short span of time, it may not be sufficient for us, it may not be possible for us to complete. And if you take section 52 of the Transfer of Property Act, list pendants, that also plays a vital role. If we decide to discuss about that, that by itself will take one day. Like that, every provision needs elaborate discussion, which cannot be achieved or accomplished in one sitting like this. I can only say that to the maximum possible within the shortest period, we can make an attempt. That is what I have done. I am very grateful for all the participants, and I express my gratitude to Mr. Dhanasekaran. With this, I conclude. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Over to you, Mr. Dhanasekaran, sir.